Palace, high above 3773 East Broadway. This is the Jake Feinberg Show, comedy on Power Talk. Thank you so much for making this part of your day today. And I started my program about a decade ago, over a decade ago. And what I've realized more than anything is that when you start to engage with spiritual musicians, doesn't matter what genre, but ultimately that spirit is eternal, and it keeps coming back around cyclically. And I had a chance last week, feels like a long time ago, but it was only last week, to go to this country club in Palm Desert, or in Cathedral City, California, to see my guest, who happened to be playing with Big Black, who is somebody that I first connected with back in 2013, and I did a couple of interviews with Black, and then wound up staying with him and at his place in Cathedral City. And then we didn't talk for a long time, and then through a buddy of mine, an amazing drummer out in California, Aaron Spursky, he hit me to his mom's husband, whose name was Tim Pleasant. And the next thing you know, I'm interviewing Tim Pleasant, and then I wind up going out, and Tim's like, "Yeah, by the way, I'm playing at this place called AJ's on the Green with, and Big Black's going to be there." And so, long and the short of it is, to come full circle, I had a chance to see Black live for the first time with a band that was being fronted by a guy I had actually never seen before, but just blew my mind. An incredible guitar player, and in my brief conversation with him afterwards, he mentioned that he's really steeped in the language of jazz, and I think the language that he understands is deeply rooted in the blues and the sanctified church and the spirituals. It goes back very far. It's not classicalized. It was very evident in his playing that he had been steeped in that, and what an honor. Guitarist Doug MacDonald, welcome to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Oh, thank you, Jake. Nice to be here, and great to see you last week on the gig.
Man, dude, do we have any new updates on AJ's, or is it still just being torn down?
Well, unfortunately, they're not tearing it down, but what they're doing is the new owner is taking over early, and he was planning to remodel in July, but he's doing it a little early in June here. And he doesn't know what he's going to do. He's supposed to bring us back in a couple of weeks, but this guy seems like he's not experienced. I hate to say it, but, club owning and club running is a big job. And if you haven't done it, you're in for a big, wake-up call. So let's keep our fingers crossed, as everybody says.
Well, I got to tell you, I mean, it to me, it's not necessarily the trendy thing to do, but I will say that the coolest part about that whole place, any kind of distractions or multi-sensory stimulation. It would be a tragedy if there were flat screen TVs put in there. It was one of the last cool listening rooms that I've been to in a long time, man.
Yeah, thanks for noticing that. Well, like I say, he
we'll see what happens,
see what happens. I told him, I said, look, just don't chase all those regulars away that you saw when you came last Wednesday. And I say, hey, don't start over from ground zero, because you got a built-in crowd that we had to build up. But now people know we're there, and they come, and et cetera, et cetera. But like you said, see what happens,
Well, let me ask you a question. I mean, if we walk down the street and ask 20 different people what their concept of jazz is, we'd probably get 20 different answers. And for somebody who grew up really conversing with a lot of masters. I mean, Stan Getz, these guys that were, I mean, it was a street language through and through, and they came up with that, and then they worked their asses off and eventually created other types of languages like bebop and things like that. I just wanted you to talk about what your concept of jazz is.
Well, there was a guitarist that was well known on his own, but he kind of got pretty well known working with Oscar Peterson and Ray Brown. His name was Herb Ellis. And he said that what's important in his mind was to know the roots of the music. And I think that's a little bit of a problem today. A lot of young kids start with Chick Corea or Herbie Hancock, which were brilliant players, but they don't necessarily go back to the very beginning of the music. The Johnny Hodges, the Charlie Christian, the Lester Young, the early pianists, all the great people, whoever they were, Art Tatum or Earl Father Hines and all that, just to know. And like you said, it's a combination of blues, swing, and, like jazz harmony, which is sort of like classical music. So it's kind of like, the way I look at it is like the classical music of the blues, if you will.
Yeah.
So,
I mean,
that's kind of what people.
I just wonder, did you have opportunities? You had like this really interesting flavor that came out. Like it was kind of like it felt like a boogaloo kind of feel to it, almost like a Boogaloo Joe Jones, or like one of those chicken scratch kind of, like you clearly were based in the blues. I just wonder about, like, if you could talk a little bit about, I've talked to a lot of cats that, one thing that came into my head was, I did a bunch of interviews with the original drummer from Paul McCartney's Wings, Denny Sywell, and he talked about basically getting kicked off the bandstand by Lou Donaldson back in the day because he couldn't play a shuffle.
Oh, yeah.
And it was like it was like cut sessions that was not unusual. And instead of like wallowing in self-pity, he just shedded it in a couple days. He came back and pulled it off. But can you talk about like a time earlier in your career when you kind of fell on your face, but in reality, looking back, it was probably the best thing that happened to you?
Well, what happened to me is I was about 13 years old, and then maybe 14, almost somewhere around there in between. I started the trombone in the school band, and I started guitar. So it was a little bit hard to try to learn two instruments at once, and I stayed with the guitar. But I played the trombone long enough to play in the wind ensemble and the orchestra, and I heard a lot of things that would be considered compositional, orchestral things. So I always had a bug to do some writing. So several years later, I studied composition with a couple teachers, one being Lyle Spud Murphy, who was kind of a famous, notorious guy. Another guy was David Blumberg. But what happened is I've always tried to combine the blues with other things, and I think part of it is because of hearing all those lines when I was playing with an orchestra and big band too. So the jazz thing is interesting, but I like to combine the two. It's almost like a weird way to look at it is like if you took two famous players, and Miles Davis always talked about this, you put them in a funnel. He was talking about trumpet players like Roy Eldridge and Dizzy Gillespie and everybody else. But
sure,
for guitar, like if you took Wes Montgomery and Johnny Smith, and Johnny Smith had loads of technique and had a beautiful harmonic concept, and of course Wes had his own harmonic concept, but more of a blues earthy type of style. If you put the two together, you've got something interesting. So I've always looked at it that way, as try to learn from the beginning to the end, and also to combine things to come up with something, because I've never been in favor of copying somebody. A lot of people transcribe solos and all that, and I say, well, I'd like to learn 4 bars of it, but not the whole thing.
Absolutely, man.
But,
no, I mean, why do you? So first of all, would you say that have you ever faced adversity on the bandstand, though? I mean, was there a seminal moment when you?
Oh yeah,
yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that was a request. Yeah, a lot of times. I was working with some groups when I was younger, like Gabe Baltazar's band.
Oh my, dude! I gotta say, I love that cat, man.
Yeah, I grew up in Hawaii. I was born in Philly, grew up in Hawaii. But I remember playing things, and I thought, well, this is new to me. And I thought, I'll get it eventually. And I was sort of a late bloomer, slow learner, where some kids learn everything at 19, and that's it. They don't really get that much better, or 23. But for me, I'm still learning today, especially with the writing. But I didn't answer your question. I'm sorry. Yeah, the adversity definitely was there. I would say on a lot of gigs, because first of all, they would call it to and they go, oh my God, I don't know that song. And when I came to the mainland from Hawaii, first of all, with Gabe Baltazar's group, I certainly felt that way. Like, I'm kind of green. I was about 23, I think. And I thought, oh geez, a lot of this stuff I better learn, which I eventually took my time and did. And then when I got to the mainland, it's like all these tunes. And I said, oh my God. So I learned a lot of songs. And then you just get experience by hanging out with, like you said, the right cats and the language and the there was an area in L.A. called Toluca Lake, and at that time there was like the Money Tree, there was Alphonse's, there was Chadney's down the street in Burbank. So, I was able to hang out with a lot of people like Ross Tompkins from The Tonight Show, and a bass player named Herb Mickman, and then a pianist named Marty Harris, and then all the name guys, the Jack Sheldons and Bob Cooper. And I got to record with a lot of these people, and Clayton Hamilton Orchestra. I just talked to John Clayton a couple days ago. But to make a long story short, yes, there was adversity, and I think it was like going to school. And I remember making rehearsal bands because it helps your reading and all that, thinking, oh, gosh, I better stay on top of this. So, yeah, there was adversity, but it was like a lesson. I agree.
I mean, I interviewed Gabe almost 10 years ago. I mean, that dude was playing with, he was so ahead of his time. I mean, can you talk a little bit about your ear? Ultimately, I feel like today, I mean, I've been, talking to a lot of the shaman cats, like Gary Bartz.
Sure.
I mean, they would say that, the cat from old school, the cats, because they basically learned to hear the music before they learned to read it, their ears were wide open. So they could really hear things, and they could hear the collective sound of the band. Whereas you have younger cats today, because we're saturated with material, that so many cats are learning stuff to read first before they learn to hear it. So their ears are actually locked a little bit. And I just wonder, how you, clearly there's an apprenticeship that goes on at AJ's, and hopefully will continue. I mean, how? Yeah. Of course, I saw a couple of cats there there's a couple cats that were on fire that were younger, that were just sort of savant characters. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about a specific band you were in where you felt like your ears grew the most and you were able to hear deeper.
Well, I think what happened is, as I was able to move to the mainland from Hawaii, I went to Las Vegas first, and I met players like Carl Fontana. I think being around, I always believed that osmosis. A drummer
totally,
named, dude. Tom Montgomery, and then a well-known bass player, Carson Smith, who made a lot of records.
Are you kidding me? Putter's brother?
Yeah.
Oh my! Wait,
yeah, Putter's brother.
I thought he died a long time ago. He was still kicking when you were there.
Oh yeah! In fact, he called me before he passed.
Oh man, dude, sick family, dude. Unreal, dude. Unreal. Yeah, that's so cool.
So Putter, I got to play with when I came to LA, and guys like Frank Stazzeri, and oh gosh, so here I'm playing with Bob Cooper and Snooky Young. Snooky was on the Tonight Show,
sure.
And I thought, well, this is great because it's more of a trad swing band than bebop, and it was good because I always liked Johnny Hodges and Coleman Hawkins, and then I got to play with people like Teddy Edwards. They're all West Coast.
Oh, I love this stuff, dude. This is you definitely were able to play with the masters, man.
Well, and it changes your playing because in Hawaii it was limited. You had people like Gabe, and I also played with Trummy Young, who was a great player. Trummy's in the movie High Society with Louis Armstrong, which has Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, Grace Kelly. So they were around all that stuff. Trummy caught the great years with Louis, and he had his own thing in Hawaii, even though he traveled all over the world. But he was a great player too. And I think what it is absorbing some of that traditional stuff helps because, like you said, in the day, like for example, John Coltrane started with Johnny Hodges, and I'm telling people that they don't seem to think that that's important. Well, yeah, it is because that's the roots of the music, like Duke Ellington and everything, and you learn something from that. Plus, you're learning to hear it, and it's not the same as just going to school. One of the philosophies I have is in the 20s, had a lot of jazz music around, and unfortunately, what happened, the culture went up. The technology went up, like musical counterpoint, contrary motion. The culture goes up, like technology, and down comes the culture. As you notice, the pop culture today, pretty bad. There's no songs. You
nailed it. I've never heard that. That's exactly the technology. Are you saying that happened 100 years ago too? Is that what you're saying in the 20s?
Well, I think in the 20s there was a lot of songs, and there was a lot of players and a lot of live music. And then when they started to record more, it slowly disappeared. And I think by the end of the 40s, and of course, it lasted into the 50s, but from the 20s to 40s, you have most of our standards. They say Great American Songbook, but I call them standard tunes. And that kind of means a commercial dance band would play them, a pop artist, a jazz artist, even a classical musician might take a standard by somebody like Gershwin and orchestrate it, or they might do something with it, a pops orchestra or something. So they kind of go to all genres. Even country people do some standards, as you notice. Like you'll hear somebody doing Honeysuckle Rose in the country field.
Absolutely.
So they kind of cross in the rock people too. I mean, everybody knows some standards because you've seen movies and you've heard records, and it's been around so long. And 99% of all the famous rock people are very familiar with all kinds of music. Even though they do rock and roll, they certainly have listened to classical music, and they've listened to the pop jazz people and the jazz people. So to make a long story short, I think what happens is I love the technology because I use writing programs and recording programs, but the culture went down. It's like counterpoint, like, the bass goes.
You're nailing it, dude. No, you're. I mean, explain what is it? Is it the reliance on because like technology? I mean, as you're getting hip to my show, you can see it's a tool. Like it's a tool, but if you become too reliant on it, then you lose your edge. I mean, is that really what's happened with culture? Is that if you become more reliant on inanimate technology, then the culture goes down?
Well, nobody really knows why.
Yep.
It should be that way. It should be everything advances, but it doesn't work that way. It's like a counteract reaction. But I can tell you this, that a lot of what happen in the new music, which some of it's great, don't get me wrong, and I studied composition, so I like fresh music and inventive ideas. In fact, even atonal music, even though most of the stuff we play is very tonal, I studied atonal writing, so I really like it, and I've done a lot of things for a large band written that way. But what I can say is that a lot of times what I find missing in the newer artists, whether they be vocalists or instrumentalists, there's a coldness to it. And I don't like to use the word it doesn't swing, but sometimes that's the factor too. It's a rhythmic thing. And they're much more versatile today with rhythms and counter rhythms and polyrhythms and time signatures. But I just think a lot of the heart of the old music, it's a different focus, I guess, maybe. Like when you had guys like Lester Young, they would play a melody, like really, really sing it, And today, they don't always think that way. They want to think, how cutting edge can I get? I'm reinventing the wheel. I'm breaking new ground. Well, I don't know if you're really breaking new ground.
I'm telling you, man. They're like. I just feel like in modern pop music, especially, like it's really it's made for pacification. It's not made for like introspection and feel and burning. I don't hear any dynamics at all, and I don't hear. I mean, and I hear so many ideas being thrown at you that there's no space. There's no space in the music, so you can't even really swing. You can't dance to it.
Well, and the thing is the instrumental jazz sort of did lose their audience when they went out of the dance mode, and everybody.
It got too precious. I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah, and even though like bebop was nice and progressive, it did lose a lot of the audience. But you've always had a strong swing jazz presence in the Roy Eldridge type people, and there's always been that thing going on. And you got to remember, even Louis Armstrong still had hits like Hello Dolly, even though it was commercial, but he was like everybody else, like Sinatra. They're trying to make a living in the music, and he had a hit with Hello Dolly in the 60s. Dave Brubeck had a hit with Take 5, which is weird because it's a drum solo, and it's in 5/4.
Right.
It's a top 40 hit. Really bizarre. In fact, Eugene Wright used to live close to me in North Hollywood, and I used to run into him. He was in Burbank. Great guy, and he was with Brubeck. He lived to be into his 90s.
I interviewed the senator, man. That dude was playing at the Regal Theater back in Chicago in the day, man.
Yep.
That dude is a bad. No, yeah. I mean, yeah. But I think here's. I think that one thing I wanted to, because we could expound on. I think that I just think that, Doug, it's like, if you're in today's world, I just ask you, can you really codify the language of jazz? Like the idea that you're going to go to a university, potentially go into debt hundreds of thousands of dollars with no guarantee of a gig on the other side. I mean, Lenny, I remember talking to all the original guys when they went to the Schillinger House, was Berkeley School, became. And like, I remember Ernie Watts saying, like, Charlie Mariano would come off the road because either he was trying to kick a habit or he'd pick up a new instrument. Right. But you'd go, it was like a trade school for already established professionals. And now you're going into school, no guarantee of a gig. And I ask you this. I mean, I know you feel blessed to have caught the tail end of these masters, the Teddy Edwards and all these amazing dudes. But do you still think that our society, and I'm not talking about the AJ's crowd, because those cats, except with, I was born in '78, but most of those cats came up when jazz was still popular music. And my question is, do you still think that a musician, younger cat, like, are they viewed as a profession, or is music viewed as a musician's gift to the world? Because it's just like Dizzy never got rich. They did okay. They did fine, and they got compensated. But now it's like, you can pay to play, or you can play for the door. You know this, and I just wonder, societally, do we still view the musician as a viable profession?
Well, the problem with live music is it's taken a beating because of the expense, mostly. Like, we talk about this guy just opening up the club or taking ownership. If you opened up a club on Sunset Boulevard, your rent's going to be insane. And my gosh, and then it's getting people in, and the band wants so much money, and you're thinking, how am I going to make this nuts? So that's a lot of the problems are economic. We're back in the 50s. Back in 1953, it wasn't as hard because now the Canarino family owned the Half Note Cafe, and I met Mike, one of the sons. He was running trumpets in Montclair, New Jersey, outside of New York, and he said it was always hard because they had the Half Note in the 50s and 60s, and he said it was always
It was Italian family.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right.
So cool.
And it was in Soho, south of Houston Street. I would say basically the problem is the laymen need the music because when they hear it, and especially young people, if they could get exposed to it, and classical music, if they get exposed to better music, they'll develop a taste for it. It's just like if you like a good wine, if you've never had wine, of course, some people should never start drinking. Have a drink.
No, I dig, man. I did.
It's like, wow, this wine is really good. I never tried it before. So, well, it's an aged Cabernet, and it's only $700 a bottle.
Right. No, but once you get a taste, you need more. You get a taste of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like coffee or tea or something. At first, kids go, "What is this?" And they go, "Oh, that's pretty good." I would say the issue is things will always change, and one of the things is if you do a gig like we did the other night. In fact, I saw Big Black on Sunday. We said, "Where are we going to go?" And actually, there was a place in Palm Desert, but I forgot about it. But it really wasn't that great anyway. But there wasn't really a lot of choices to go on a Sunday night to hear somebody, especially like 8 o'clock at night.
Right.
So I think a lot of it, but I think the thing is the young kids have one advantage is that a lot of people, like the jazz legends, if they were still alive now, like a Sonny Rollins, he's going to be able to make better money per concert. And I heard it's quite a bit now if Sonny does a concert. So I think that's like if Oscar Peterson were still alive, he'd demand pretty good money for a concert. On the non-famous level, all the kids, a lot of them are lucky because there's a surge of young people from the schools. And like you said, a lot of them would have a hard time because they'll just have to start teaching or doing whatever. But I think there is a interest in the young talent. Like labels want to record, I call them everybody's 13. Well, they're more like 19, but I say everybody's 13 today or 23 years old. But so there is a chance for the young people to do well because they do seem to look out for that. And a lot of it is They have a lot of peers from their school, like USC or the new school in New York or wherever they go, Berkeley, like you mentioned. So let's say they go to the new school in New York and their teacher and they're just like UCLA Film School, they're walking out of school with connections. And I think that's what's happening. I have a couple students that I teach, and they, went to USC, and they're going to be well connected. Besides the piece of paper, which is great to have, they're going to have connections in the business and even in the jazz business. So it's very youth oriented, not just music, but Hollywood. Like for script writers, producers, as you've heard, everybody's 13 years old. Go to a bar now, and we're the oldest guys.
That's right. No, but here's the thing. We can pivot out of here, but I wanted to ask you. I mean, the reason I'm infatuated with the music of a certain period of time in our history, I don't care if it was Lee Morgan or Miles or Dizzy or Pete LaRocca, Mickey Rourke or Max Roach. I mean, everybody had their own individual sound, right? And they were still singing for their supper, being able to make creative, individual sounding music. Everybody had their own individual sound, but now we're in this time of comping and conformity.
Yeah.
And I think the connections are great.
Yeah.
I mean, that's cool. But as a true creative musician, I mean, once this stuff gets assimilated and digested by the general public, all of a sudden you lose all creative control and you have to sound like somebody else. That's my issue, is like, you go into the university, you come out sounding like your professor. I know there's a couple of people that'll break through, but nobody can do it alone. It wasn't just Dizzy. There were like 4 dozen or more, hundreds of cats, and they were able to make a living playing themselves. And I just feel like if I was behind the microphone and I had somebody and I was getting a paycheck and someone was telling me the questions that I needed to ask Doug MacDonald, I'd get pretty burned out after a while. And I just feel like that's the crisis now, is like you cannot... If you're doing what you feel is individualistic or unique, good luck to you. And I just wish we could return to that fearlessness, because we are just bending. I can't tell who anybody is anymore, really. I mean, that was why it was cool to hear you play guitar, because it was yourself. And I just don't think kids feel that they have to learn. They can learn all the Charlie Parker stuff. They can transcribe all the solos. But then what is your story? And I think that they're afraid to necessarily tell the story because they're not going to be able to make a living doing that.
Well, that you're actually right on one point. I can't argue with all that. I think the problem is I somehow figured out when I was young, like I said, I started playing guitar and trombone about 13 or 14. And after a couple of years, I wasn't sure what to do, and then jazz became my thing. And I always had an ear for the compositional side. But I always felt like you shouldn't copy anybody, and I don't know if it's the older musicians telling me that, or it's just the fact I felt that was not the way for me. And I was, like I said, I always felt like Miles, like shove that stuff in a funnel. Like you said, put all your favorite players.
Right, blend it up. Yeah, exactly. Dude. I love it.
Yeah, and then that's why I always felt like Johnny Smith and Wes Montgomery. Or you could say somebody like, I'm just trying to think of guitarists that people are familiar with, because I can mention some names they don't. Maybe Grant Green and George Van Epps. I mean, that's pretty wild.
I love that. That's a huge spectrum right there. It's perfect.
Yeah, George Van Epps was so harmonically great, and I got to play with him once or twice and hang out with him. What a brilliant guy.
Dude, brilliant dude,
about
man.
And I won't get on a tangent here, but
it's fine.
Talked about doing a duo with Fats Waller in New York in a little tiny place. I mean, here's George Van Epps and Fats Waller. I can't believe it. Then he talked about sitting on George. It was out in Plainfield, New Jersey. George, the family being musicians. George Gershwin, he's sitting on Gershwin's knee, as a kid. Wow. I mean, on and on and on. I mean, these stories. But yeah, I mean, I always felt like, okay, fine. Try to copy Wes Montgomery. I think I read that once. It said, somebody wrote it, one of the famous cats, like if you try to copy Bird or Wes or somebody, you're always going to be behind. Oh, they knew what they were going to do next and you don't, I think. Maybe it was Wes that said that. He said, if you try to copy somebody, they always know what they're going to do next, and you don't. You know what I mean? It's a
Absolutely.
weird kind of philosophy.
I mean, no, I just want to say something though. Like, I mean, I got in one of my interviews with the late great Joe Sample. He said that.
Oh, sure.
He said he went to. He was such a beautiful guy, and he's like, I went to Wes Montgomery's house in Indianapolis one day, and he's like, I think he was working on a song, and he showed up, and Wes is playing him this song, and Joe said, well, what chord was that? And Wes said, I have no idea. And he goes, well, what chord was that? He goes, I have no idea. And Joe's like, you mean to tell me that you have no idea what you're playing? Like, he had no idea. It was so.
I have a plot.
Yeah. What I'm saying is, like, you can't study that. Period. I mean, the man was a concrete mixer. He had 8 kids. He lived the blues. I mean, he was living his life. He was playing his life. So, like, the idea of saying, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna cop Wes licks." Wes didn't even know technically what and that's the brilliance of this street scholar mentality, is that you talked about him having an earthy feel. It was totally indigenous. It was not in a book.
Well, I think, first of all, that was a musical family. I met 2 of the brothers. I met Monk Montgomery when he was playing Fender bass, electric
oh, my
bass,
God.
And then I met Buddy Montgomery in San Francisco once. He was playing some gig, I forget with who. They used to play a lot together, and Buddy played vibes and piano, and Monk played bass, and I think there was other members that were around playing with them. And the way I understand it, I've looked at Wes's stuff closely, and I would say that that's true what you're saying, but he did know more than he was saying. Now, here's another factor. They mentioned guys like Wes or Earl Garner that didn't read music. I don't think that all of them are that way. I think they just are not sight readers where they could look.
Absolutely. You're 100% right. No, yeah. Totally. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, they could read something. A lot of them could, because it's not that hard to read, like Mary Had a Little Lamb, but then to read a symphonic score is a different thing. And sometimes the simpler stuff is harder. But anyway, to get back to Wes, he did understand progressions, because if you listen and look at what somebody transcribed, it does make musical sense. Like, I don't want to get technical with people, but he's doing G minor 9 to C13 flat 9 and F major 9. Those are like standard jazz type chord progressions, which they do in classical music too. They just don't necessarily do it always in rock and roll. Sometimes they do. Other times it's 3 chords. And then certain blues artists like T-Bone Walker and B.B. King would use more progressions than just the 3 chords, depending on the tune. And then other blues artists are like the folk blues, just 3 chords.
Sure.
But the thing with Wes is it makes perfectly sense with voice leading and harmony. So since he had brothers that played music, I know they played together. They rehearsed a lot. And then there was also other musicians that he was playing with later on, people like Harold Land and all that. So they did basically understand the harmony, but sometimes maybe they don't know what the school term for it is, or the...
Absolutely. No, dude, let's be very clear. Let's be totally clear, Doug. I mean, Wes Montgomery, I remember Michael Howell, great guitar player, walked into a club in San Francisco, and, like, Wes, a dear friend, and he, like, sits down at the front table, and he said Wes just looked at him, and he was playing, and Wes is like, oh, yeah, you think you're a bad man, and he just went... I mean, the man was a total genius. It's just, there was nothing intellectual about it. There was no intellectualism about it. It was just, he understood.
Well, I would say it's like Louis Armstrong. They have their own way of treating. It's like they say, like Louis Armstrong or Zoot Sims didn't think about the changes, but yet they did, because they tend to play the better notes. Just like a guy like, you can tell he's an arranger. A guy like, he passed away, Al Cohn. His notes were so good.
Oh my God!
I tell a lot of sax players, like, his notes are great because he's a great writer. There's a guy here in L.A., Kim Richmond, wonderful writer, beautiful alto player, and the guys like that write, I can hear, the arranger's influence in their playing. Years ago too, without getting off the subject, they discouraged that because, especially studios, wanted you to be a player or writer. You can't do both, because we need you as one or the other. And I get that when there's work 24/7, but the idea is,
exactly,
what's wrong with me? like look at Debussy. He played great piano and he could orchestrate. Ravel too. They were great players, and Chopin and everybody else. But I'm just saying, there's a lot of myths in music. Like, oh, if I learn to read music, there goes my jazz playing. Well, that's a bunch of BS. I think Wes was more in people think, but he might have had his own method. Just like if you measure in millimeters or inches, it's a different concept. It's like he's doing it in Greek and you and I are doing it in English.
Absolutely. I will. Yeah. It's cool because when I heard that, I mean, Joe was really just talking about like he was just talking about the idea that like someone like Sonny Stitt, when he first came up, everybody was comparing him to Bird, and Joe's like, that's insane. Why would I don't want to be the next Bird. I want to be my own. And so Stitt eventually had to pivot out of that. And he was just talking about,
he did.
Ultimately, whatever languages and how big is, I mean, Dennis Coffey, I mentioned to you, the guy from Motown, one of the original Funk Brothers, and he was out in L.A. I mean, he'd go see Wes. I mean, Wes was a profound dude. I mean, he maybe couldn't even articulate it. He just knew it. There's no doubt. It's just the idea of being a street scholar. And by the way, you probably know this, but first dude to be playing electric bass on a jazz album, Monk Montgomery, 1953, Art Farmer. I don't know if you knew that or not.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Oh, I got this wrong.
1953. So, I mean, like, the point is that, like, you play enough with your peers, with your family, you're going to get stuff together. But, we have a game on this program, Doug, called Name That Voice. Take a listen to this.
Oh, good.
Take a listen to this. You may pay attention to the content,
right,
and we'll come back.
Sure.
You know what I'm saying? So the music went from the street inside. You see what I'm saying? So the only place to play was the jazz parlors, in the parlor of the jazz house. So all the black artists became, in the white community, jazz house coons. And you can go on the internet, or you can go to the library and pick up sheet music from the days when they printed music, coon music, they call it, with a comic strip version of a black person on the cover of the music sheet, dressed in a top hat, you know what I'm saying, and a red coat, and you know what I'm saying, all of that shit. All of that shit relates to jazz. You see what I'm saying? The feeling that was that the people had for the music that they supposed to love so much today. You understand? The music that more white cats are getting rich off today than black cats. I've always been that way. You understand? Blacks never made a dime from jazz. I mean, Disney, all of those cats you thought was making money. They made a little money. You understand? But they weren't making the kind of money they should have made. You know what I'm saying? And I know that. I saw how they lived. They had a good life, but they didn't have a great life. And so what they did, what they brought to the music scene, they should have all had a great life. You understand what I'm saying? I mean, what do you think of Duke Ellington playing back-to-back with the average white band? You understand? And they're paying the average white band $90,000 a night, and giving Duke Ellington $20,000 for his big magnificent band.
Mm-hmm.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about, the difference between the music and this whole commercial aspect of what America has always been. You understand? Who spends the most money, who draws the most money, makes the most money. It has nothing to do with how long you've been in the business or what you bring to it as a genius. You understand? You don't make a dime unless you get average white band was obviously drawing $90,000 worth of people in the room.
All right, Doug MacDonald, do you know who that is?
That's BB, Big Black. I call it BB.
BB. Well, by the way, Pleasant tossed me the Gumbo CD with you and this guy Shelley, ridiculous sax player, man, unreal show. But that was my interview. Believe it or not, I just want to say how special it was to see you last week because, believe it or not, that interview was from August of 2012. So I mean,
that long ago.
Yeah, so I mean, like to see Black play, I never saw him play live. It was such an honor to see that, and you know, that was revelatory. The idea that like, you know, Duke Ellington could be on a bill with the average white band, and the average white band's getting 90 grand, and Duke Ellington's getting 20 grand. And you know, I wanted you to just talk about if you, from your own point of view, I know you weren't, you know, kicking it with back in the 50s with Van Epps and Pass and those cats, but I mean, did you gravitate to melodic improvisation or jazz because it was always about there were so many geniuses, unheralded geniuses? I mean, there's something about pulling for the underdog that's always been part of my ethos, whether it's sports or whatever it is. And I wanted you to just talk. I mean, there's been a lot of commercialization of the music. Like we've talked about the codifying components of the music. I don't hear that when I hear you're playing, because you were in the funnel. I mean, you were in the funnel. Luckily, you were able to come out of that and sing for your supper. But I just wanted to know why you were attracted to playing basically an African-American art form.
Right, exactly. Well, like you said, it's the classical music of the blues,
right.
And I think that's kind of what it is. I think that when I first started, I listened to everything, and I had heard all kinds of records from classical to pop music and everything else. But I think I found the jazz thing because I wasn't really felt like I was destined to be a vocalist. I tried it as a kid, and I don't know, didn't feel comfortable with it. I don't know why. Maybe it was the pitch or something about, well, I can't control this. And of course, anything you could do if you want to. But then I noticed that jazz was blues, but more advanced and more instrumental, if you were. It wasn't necessarily as most of the blues stuff was vocal, and they do that today. They try to make jazz vocal, but it's not as vocal. There's part of the music is vocal, but a lot of times now, especially on the West Coast, they have a jazz gig. They feel like they got to put a singer in front.
Right.
And I like both, and I love backing them up. There's a lot of training to be an accompanist. That's a very separate skill than a soloist, and I try to learn that too. But one of the things is that if you look at Barney Kessel, who I knew, is another guy that passed. Okay, in his day, talking to Ron Estee, another guitarist, about that. In his day, here he starts with jazz at the Philharmonic. He's playing with Oscar and Ray, and then he's working with Billie Holiday, and he's working with all the jazz greats, and he's in Italy, and he's at a cafe backing up just informally with Lester Young and Billie Holiday. He takes his guitar out. But they're from that era when that was in vogue, so to speak. But nowadays, as Barney said years ago, he said it's really crowded now. And Chuck Niles, the jazz DJ, said that there's just a lot of people out there, and the public doesn't know one bass player from the other, one drummer from the other. And the problem with the market is that's another issue. It's saturated. But I think for me, I was attracted to it because it made sense logically. Because a friend of mine said, well, I remember when you were 15, you were playing more blues and stuff. I said, well, I just wasn't sure which way to go. By the time I was 16, I was definitely into it because I felt, he says, well, why? I said, well, it's just a natural progression. It's like moving from novelty music to classical music. It's like you think, well, you know, you got these kind of, you know, cornball. Well, I hate to call it cornball because some of it's great, but you know, like some of this novelty music that's not really tongue in cheek, or it's whatever it is. But you get into a more serious music, and you know, the thing is, I think I just gravitate. To me, it's a natural progression. You just progress to the instrumental music that's more sophisticated or more involved. But now, unfortunately, politics is really predominant more than it was in the 50s or 40s. I think it was somewhat, but record labels were going, I want the best player. Okay, I want Oscar Peterson. I want Charlie Parker. I want Tal Farlow. You know, I want Billie Holiday. But today, you know, as you know, and you have probably a better handle on that than I do, but the way the politics work, it's like someone says, hey, you got to use my guy. You know,
that's exactly that is really. I think actually I don't. That's really kind of inside baseball stuff And that's true. They
Yeah.
they want to play it safe and go with their connections and their people as opposed to the people that can serve the song best.
I was surprised some of the people that got signed when they were signing people, like I forget what label it was. It might have been, I can't, it doesn't matter. Concord even. But the records didn't necessarily do well, as you know, even with names. But, okay, they said we only use named people on certain concerts or certain recordings contracts. Yet I see somebody I never heard of, and I hear it, and I go, well, they're very good, but I'm surprised they got signed. I mean, it wasn't like they were, leaving everybody in the dust. And, it's more about musicality. Like I mentioned, people like Johnny Hodges again, or Roy Eldridge. It's Lester Young. It's a quality of music. It's not how many notes you can play, too, because a lot of people think, well, so-and-so played the most notes, so therefore he's the better player.
Yeah.
Listen to Jim Hall. It's not the case, It's a combination of things, just like classical music. It isn't one thing the composer's doing. It's the way they orchestrated it. It's the way they have their lines they wrote. It's the space. It's like you said, there's a flair to it. It's a skill. So it's very difficult sometimes for the layman to tell the difference. It's like weeds are weed out in the woods. They look alike, but one is a weed and one is wheat.
No, first of all, I cannot believe that one of the reasons that I got infatuated with my dear friend, the Skipper Henry Franklin or Big Black or all these cats is because of guys like Chuck Niles, because I would buy these random records on Catalyst or something, and Henry's like, and all of a sudden you're reading about these guys and you're seeing the accompanist and you're like, these dudes have been through it, man. And then all of a sudden you reach out and they're accessible and you bring them on the program and you reveal information. Right. It's just like this whole, it always was a subculture. Liebman even said that through the 70s, it was still a black subculture. That's what it was. Yeah. And you could feel that. And then there was all this civil rights stuff. But I guess maybe the best, instead of pontificating, what is the best advice that you can give to younger cats who are seekers, knowing that the game is kind of already, I don't want to say fixed, but like you said, it's like, how did he get signed? Well, it's
jaded. It's very jaded.
Yes.
It's like right. A skew. I would say find, like you said earlier, find your own voice. Try to stick with great musical elements like fresh rhythms and your own harmonic way and your own melodic way. And it's almost like you want to have your own voice. You don't want to sound, if you were a singer, you don't want to sound like Carmen McRae. You don't want to sound like June Christie. You want to sound like yourself. And the biggest problem today is our man Frank Sinatra. Everybody wants to be Frank Sinatra. Well, what they did in music, they tried to make one guy. Oh, it's all Sinatra. It's not all Sinatra. You got Billy Eckstine, you got Johnny Hartman, you got Joe Williams. You got a lot of people.
Eddie Jefferson.
I think what I'm saying. Yeah, there's a lot of people, and I think the problem is when you make one guy like Buddy Rich. They do that with Joe Pass or Wes too, and of course we love them. And I got to know Joe, and I got to play with him. I never met Wes. I met his two brothers. But the idea is that it becomes the kind of thing where, you have to find your own identity. And the best way is to develop it through musical skills as strong as you can. Because one of the problems with a lot of people is, even though they've gone to school, there's still some musical skills missing. And I don't know if it's self-discipline in developing certain things, but I think it's almost going back to the composers where they didn't sound alike. Ravel and Debussy don't sound anything alike, and there's hundreds of years apart, in not those two, but other people. Obviously, Bach was hundreds of years earlier, but, they don't sound anything alike. And I think if you had one guy, like, okay, Bach was it, he was the greatest of all time, then there's no reason for somebody, let's say, like Chopin to write something or Mozart to write something, because Bach already did it. So right, Bird did everything. If Buddy Rich, Joe Pass did everything, because that's what happens is you end up where there's nowhere to go because they made one guy in. Like there's nothing after Sinatra, so everybody sounds the same. They all are doing Sinatra tributes today. I'm tired of it. I know Frank was great, and
dude, you're nailing it. I said there is no. It's gonna just take absolutely fearless sound seekers like Harold Mayburn and Charles Lloyd, George Coleman, all those guys. I mean, to me, it also is a reflection of our dysfunction. I mean, music is. I remember a great percussionist, Tony Waters, who played with Blakey. He said, he's like, man, he's like, even through the hardest times, sociologically, politically. And he was referring to the Vietnam War. He's like, the music always carried us through. I mean, you listen to the music from that era, the jazz, it's explosive, and now it's and part of it's also what we didn't talk about. It's just younger cats, especially like my daughters, I mean, they listen to all types of music, so their ears are wide open. But like most kids, they don't even know that they're listening to mechanized rhythm. All they've heard is drum machines their whole life. So you have cats that are.
It's definitely the technology versus the creative. And technology is great. I use
you got to use it as a tool, but don't. If you become too reliant on it, you become an automaton.
Yeah, and it's great because I can write something here and back and say, "Oh, there's a wrong note there," or something. But and I don't know. It's a difficult thing because a lot of people cannot tell the difference between Wes and a student or a singer. Let's say, like I'm trying to think who's any great, even a pop singer. They can't tell the difference between Doris Day and some young girl that's just
that's right.
Out.
Yeah,
And here's a seasoned professional that was like doing It's You or No One in a 1949 movie with Paige Cavanaugh, Al Viola on guitar, doing It's You or No One as a ballad the original way, and that's 1949. And I mean, all those years of singing, forget the acting, but just the singing all those years, Les Brown and his band of renown, but they're all great music there, whether it's pop or jazz, whatever it is, it's still good. But I think a lot of times people cannot tell the difference. They don't know, like you said, let's say King Pleasure, there's another guy from some, I don't know, 18-year-old kid. And there's nothing wrong with the 18-year-old kid. I mean, some of them are great, but it's just a problem today. No one knows the difference. And, you go down the street and let's say some guy's working the jackhammer on the street during construction. You say, "Excuse me, sir, did you know who Milt Jackson is?" He goes, "Who?"
Yeah, no, I mean, you have to be, you have to be a little bit curious.
Yes.
And anyway, I got one more voice for you, and then we'll come back.
Sounds great.
We have to be self-sufficient as far as rhythm is concerned. We cannot rely on the drum to dictate for us the time and the rhythm, the measurement. We have to be secure in our own ability to stay within the structure, the rhythmic structure. We have these multiples of two, basically every 4 bars. That's the way we separate that. And if we can feel every 4 bars, then we can feel every 8 bars, and then we can feel every 16 bars. It becomes so natural that we don't have to really count. We just feel the space. So once you're secure in your ability to feel the space, you don't need the drums to keep time for you. But you also have to be very connected. You have to be very connected to that space that you're feeling, because drummers like Elvin, and there are a few others that play within the time, but they're sort of floating with the time. They're not actually marking the time for you. They're playing within the time, but it's like sailing over the time, playing a musical and rhythmical, of course, a musical and rhythmical way, in such a way that it floats. It floats. Nobody's.
That was my interview with Julian Priester, and I just as we wrap up set one here, I kind of wanted to ask you about how you have learned your own inner time feel, and how you learn to be less reliant on the rhythm section itself, and just sort of keep time on your own.
Well, that's a great question, and I've thought about that a lot. I was doing one gig one time, and for some reason the drummer wasn't making it, and the piano player who was sitting in just said, "Boy, you just went straight ahead." I said, "Well, I learned it like a lot of guys like Charlie Parker would do a gig, and they wouldn't know the song yet because it was like in those days it was new music standards, like The Song Is You by Jerome Kern. So that he'd come to the bridge, he'd just play it himself. So I learned to be self-reliant. Also, mentioning people like Joe Pass, since he played a lot of solo in his career, I learned that sometimes you have to go play alone. So when you go into time, you really have to make sure you have a handle on it. And what I like about time is it's like a rubber band. You can, like the big bands like Basie do that. They swell, they retract. It's not so metronomic. But one of the things I studied, besides the composition, is conducting, and I studied with a great conductor who played trumpet named Jack Fearman. And one of the things I learned when I learned conducting, I figured a better way to control that. Like if you're playing alone, you might want to start rubato. Then you go to tempo, and then you come to the end of a cadence, you might want to stretch it by a bar. And the same thing if conducting an orchestra, you have complete control over it. Now, with a band in jazz, it's interplay, but if it's not happening, you have to go straight ahead. And that's one of the things I remember hearing about players is they would just nail it. You know, if everybody else falls off, you just keep going. So it's kind of an inner thing you have to develop, I believe, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I got to tell you, man, I can't wait. Please let me know about AJ's and I look forward to coming out again and seeing you real soon.
Well, yeah, and if you're ever in Pasadena, I'm doing Thursdays at Edward Mills. And you can always call me. I'll give you the details. And then how do I access this? Do you want to text me?
Yeah, I'll send you. I'll send you. I'll send you a copy. All right, man.
Yeah, I love it. Thanks for doing this. It was a blast.
Yeah,
you're a great interviewer.
Thank you, man. Much love to you.
Yeah, same to you.
Take care,
buddy.
man. Later.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.